welcome to this new session. I'm sorry about my voice. I have a bit of a cold tonight, but we're very excited again to have you here with us tonight for another educational webinar, this time with a special guest. Laura Passalent is with us tonight. Laura is a physiotherapist, and she'll be talking to us about physical activity and AXPA. We're very excited to have her here tonight. She will be answering your questions. So please share with us where you're from, what are your objectives for tonight, and if you have any particular question for her, please do not hesitate to drop it in the Q&A. Small note here, next week we'll have the same webinar, but a French version with Gligor Diab from Montreal. So we're very excited also to have him. So we'll probably drop a link to register for next week if you feel more comfortable in French. So that's pretty much it. And well, yeah, I mean, you all know the CSA and trying to provide you the support that you need. So please also feel free to visit our website and register if you haven't already. And if you can, donate. This is an association that is done for patients, and we're trying to give you all the support that you need, but we also need some support. So if you guys can, please go to our website and donate. We are here for you. We are here to empower you to live better with this disease. And again, thank you all for attending this webinar. We're very excited to have you. So in the meantime, just to give a couple of minutes for everyone to log in, how about you share with us where you're coming from? And again, if you have any specific objective, any questions, we're here for you. Well, the good thing is this webinar is recorded. So, hey, from Alberta. The good thing is this webinar is recorded. So if you missed the webinar, you can always see it. You can always see the recorded version that will be available forever on the website. Thanks, Dan, for sharing the link. This is very important. Thank you for all the support. Hello from BC. So let us start this webinar. Again, thank you again for being here. My name is Eli Karam. I'm the chair of the Canadian Spondylitis Association, and we're very happy to have you here. The CSA is proud to present yet another educational webinar, and this time on physical activity. We are happy to have you here. If you're a first-time comer, you're welcome. The CSA, the mission of the CSA is to be the leading voice of the Spondy community all over Canada. We're here to support you. If you didn't register yet or you're not a member yet of the CSA, please go to the website and register. It is totally free. This material, support, advocacy, awareness, this is all for you. We are here to empower you to live better with AS and SPA in general. So let me introduce you our guest for tonight. Laura Passalent is an advanced practice physio practicing in Toronto Western Hospital. She's part of the Spondylitis program. She's also a clinician investigator at Krembil Institute, and she's also a lecturer at the Department of Physiotherapy. Laura, thank you so much for being here again today. We're very excited to have you. Everyone, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A. We'll answer all your questions at the end. Laura, I'll give you the mic.
Thank you, Eli, for that kind introduction. And hello, everybody. And just give me a minute while I bring up my slides. Uh-oh, you're getting a sneak peek. Okay, here we go. So everybody can see that and can hear me? Thumbs up, Eli. Wonderful. So I would just like to thank the Canadian Spondylitis Association as well as SPARCC for inviting me to speak to you this evening. So as Eli mentioned, I will be talking about physical activity and axial spondyloarthritis. So I'll be sort of talking for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then at the end of all that, we'll have lots of opportunity for questions. And as Eli mentioned, you can drop them in the Q&A. So the objectives of this evening's talk is first to sort of talk about physical activity in general terms and review current guidelines. And then we're going to talk about physical activity specifically as it relates to axial spondyloarthritis. We're going to sort of review some of the important guidelines around physical activity and management of axial spondyloarthritis. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to get started into physical activity if you're not used to it. And I'll be providing some examples and instructions of some basic home stretching and strengthening exercises. So what I'm going to do here, sorry, I'm just making myself a bit smaller. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about in general terms is what is physical activity? So physical activity is any bodily movement. So basically just moving around. And this movement is produced by skeletal muscles that requires energy expenditure. So this could include leisure activity. So what you do sort of on your time off, housework, employment. Do you have a very sedentary role at work or do you have a very active role in your job? It also relates to transportation in the sense of how do you get back and forth from work? For example, how do you commute? Do you walk to work? Do you bike to work? Or do you sit in traffic for 2 hours back and forth? And it also includes exercise. So exercise is a component of physical activity. So this is sort of a pseudo poll. It's not a true Zoom poll, but it is meant to basically get you thinking. So at a minimum, how many minutes in a week should you engage in physical activity in order to gain the health benefits? So we have A, 200 minutes, B, 800 minutes, C, 150 minutes, D, 50 minutes, E, 75, or F, you're not sure. So I'll pause here. If you feel like throwing it in the chats, go ahead. If not, that's okay. We'll just take a little moment there for you to contemplate that. Does anybody feel brave to put it in the chat? I don't know if I can see it in the chat. Somebody said C. Monique. Christopher says F. Anybody else want to give it a go? Okay. So the answer is, let's see if it comes up here. Oh, why is my thing not working now? There we go, 150 minutes per week. So that means you have to engage in some form of physical activity at least 150 minutes a week in order to gain the health benefits. And the nice thing about this is it doesn't have to be 150 minutes all at once. It can be bouts of a minimum of 10 minutes or more. And in order to gain the health benefits, it has to be either moderate or vigorous intensity of aerobic physical activity. And we'll explain what that means in a minute. So when it comes to the intensity, so duration is important and frequency is important, but intensity is also important in order to gain physiological benefit. So moderate intensity physical activity will cause you to sweat, but also you'll need to breathe a little bit harder. And so some examples of this is brisk walking, bike riding, but I always use what's called the talk test. So the talk test means if you're engaged in a form of physical activity and you're sweating, but you're able to maintain a conversation, that's a good example of moderate intensity physical activity. Vigorous intensity physical activity is when you're sweating, but you become out of breath. You can't maintain that conversation with your friend if you're going for a jog, for example. So that just gives you an idea of the level of intensity required when you engage in physical activity in order to gain the physiological benefits. Now, something that we often forget that is a part of physical activity, and these are also part of the Canadian guidelines around physical activity, is the importance around strengthening. So It's really important to add muscle and bone strengthening activities using major muscle groups at least 2 days a week. And we'll give some examples of that towards the end of this presentation. So what I just reviewed is sort of physical activity in general terms, but now we're going to talk about physical activity specifically as it relates to axial spondyloarthritis. So physical activity and exercise really are a cornerstone of management alongside pharmacological management when it comes to the treatment of AxSpA. And this has been endorsed by many different establishments. It's established in treatment guidelines. And this is just one example from the European European Rheumatology Association, who have provided recommendations specifically for physical activity in people with inflammatory arthritis, including individuals with spondyloarthritis. And there's been a lot of research conducted on the benefits of physical activity in people with axial spondyloarthritis. And we know from research that it improves function, you get increased exercise capacity, and you see improvement in spinal mobility. But people with axial spondyloarthritis who are engaged in more sedentary behaviors have lower exercise capacity and poorer quality of life. And these results are from a recent study from 2020. Now, if you look at all of the evidence supporting physical activity in the treatment of axial spondyloarthritis, you see that there's many, many benefits to be had. And this includes improvement in spinal mobility, overall strength, cardiovascular fitness, function, sleep, improvement in well-being, and quality of life. But we also see a reduction in pain, tenderness, and morning stiffness. And very importantly, when you engage in physical activity, it helps prevent chronic disease. And this is critical for people with ankylosing spondylitis, as we know that individuals with AS are at higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So how are we doing though in terms of recommendations? So this was a study that was published in 2020 out of the Netherlands. And what they did is it was a systematic review where they examined all the literature looking at how individuals with axial spondyloarthritis were engaging in the various forms of exercise. And so if we look at mobility exercise on the top line here, for example, one study found that 43% of patients performed home stretching weekly. In another study, they found only 26% of patients executed back exercises. When we look at strengthening exercises, we see only 10% of axial spondyloarthritis patients engaged in strengthening compared to 27% among population controls. And similarly, when they looked at cardiorespiratory exercises, maybe a third of patients were exercising at vigorous intensity for at least 30 minutes, 2 to 3 times per week. So what this is telling us is that although physical activity and exercise is critical in terms of management, it doesn't seem like people with AxSpA are engaging in those forms of exercise and physical activity in the amount needed to really gain the benefit. So why is that? So in 2019, we at the Toronto Western Hospital, the research team there, and you'll recognize Dr. Haroon and Dr. Inman over on the right-hand corner. So they're the rheumatologists that I work with. We got a grant from CIORA, which is the Canadian Rheumatology Association, and we partnered with the CSA to examine what it takes for patients to engage in physical activity. Now, this particular study was just published in September in Arthritis Care and Research, and it examined the motivators, barriers, and opportunity for e-health to encourage physical activity. For the purpose of tonight's talk, I'm only going to focus on the motivators and barriers to physical activity in AxSpA. So the objectives of our study were fourfold. So what we wanted to do in terms of looking at motivators and barriers was first to determine AxSpA patients' definition of physical activity, and we wanted to identify the facilitators and barriers to engaging in physical activity. We also wanted to explore the importance of physical activity in the context of AXSPA. And I really want to emphasize that this study, it's a qualitative descriptive study that really leverages the lived experiences of people who have been diagnosed with axial spondyloarthritis. They do involve patients living in the province of Ontario, and without their contributions, I wouldn't be presenting to you the results this evening. So I want to thank everybody who was diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis and non-radiographic AXSPA who shared their experience with physical activity. So just so you get a little understanding of the methods, so as mentioned, this was a qualitative study. So what we did is we basically interviewed people who were diagnosed with axial spondyloarthritis and attending our urban academic clinic in Toronto. And we had semi-structured interviews that were conducted over the phone, audio recorded, and then transcribed verbatim. What we did with all this information is then we started to develop, it's called a thematic analysis. So we assigned themes and codes according to those objectives that I just stated. And we kept interviewing people with AXSPA until we started to hear the same things over and over again. So that's called saturation of emergent themes. And so once we got to this stage, we then went through all of the transcripts, which was quite large, and we basically came up with an overall aggregation of these themes, and you use a systemic and inductive labeling, and anyways, you come up with basically an overall picture of how patients with axial spondyloarthritis are perceiving physical activity and how they identified the barriers and facilitators to engaging in physical activity. So in terms of the results of this study, we interviewed a total of 12 people with AXSPA, and the vast majority were male. So about 83% were male. Mean age 45 years, and a mean duration of just over 20 years. So these were experts in their diagnosis, so long-standing disease duration. Just over half were receiving biologic treatment, and they had good disease activity, so good control over their disease activity as measured by the BASDI. I'm sure many are familiar with filling out that questionnaire. So a low score indicates good disease control. And they also had high function. So again, with the BAS-Phi, I'm sure everybody's been filling out questionnaires, at least those who have attended the Toronto clinic, that a low score indicates high function. So low disease activity, high functioning individuals. So what we did is we reviewed the key informant interviews, and these resulted in the following overall themes. And again, these are reflective of the study objectives. So we looked at physical activity definition, we looked at the role of physical activity in axial spondyloarthritis, and really drilled down on the facilitators and barriers to engaging in physical activity. So we're going to go through each of these separately. So in terms of how participants defined physical activity, they stated that it's any activity involving physical exertion, including exercise and other activities such as transportation, employment, housework, as well as seasonal activities. And you'll see that the seasonal activities is a bit of a theme on its own, and maybe it's a product of living in Canada, I'm not sure, but you'll see how it keeps coming up. Interestingly, some participants exclusively defined physical activity as exercise and did not consider activity related to household chores or employment as part of their definition. So you start to see the spectrum of how different people identify physical activity. In terms of the role of physical activity in axial spondyloarthritis, people acknowledge that there's some very direct benefits to physical activity, including symptom control around reduced pain and stiffness, improving sleep quality, improvement in fatigue, greater function, and improved quality of life. But people also identified some indirect benefits, and this included the adoption of other beneficial health behaviors. So people who were engaging in physical activity and started to notice improvement in their symptoms, this had a cascade effect into other areas of health behavior. So people indicated that that motivated them to stop smoking. They looked at, the diets, they tried to optimize what they were eating, and they really focused on the prevention of other chronic diseases. In addition, another indirect benefit that was commonly relayed in the interviews is improvement in mental health and well-being. There were three other important aspects that participants identified in terms of the role of physical activity in AXSPA, and that is that the benefits are not immediate and that the benefits take time to develop. And individuals participating in this study really emphasized the importance of education from healthcare providers to patients so that patients understand how to manage expectations about benefit from physical activity. The other thing that was commonly stated in interviews is that there's a really strong synergy between the pharmacological management and physical activity, and that the combination of these two things together really outweigh how you would benefit from each individually. So something really important, the message there is, even though you may be feeling very good on biologics, if you add physical activity and exercise on top of that, you're going to feel even better. So we looked at the facilitators, so the things that promoted physical activities in our participants, and we divided these into intrinsic motivators, so things that within the patient really drove their participation in physical activity, and extrinsic motivators, so things external to the patient. And some of the intrinsic motivators were, as mentioned, mental health benefits, symptom improvement, improvement in strength and flexibility. And people also acknowledged that their pre-diagnostic physical activity was important in the ability of their ability to integrate exercise and physical activity into their daily routine after diagnosis. And so what this translated into was improved self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is one's confidence in their ability to manage their disease through physical activity. They also talked about positive outlook of physical activity and how this was critical in reframing pre-diagnostic attitudes and belief about physical activity. And this led to easier incorporation of physical activity on a regular basis. In terms of extrinsic motivators, social support networks are critical. So having the support of friends, family, healthcare providers, professional guidance from healthcare providers, so guidance from the rheumatologist, their family physician, physiotherapists, exercise trainers out in the community, and access to exercise facilities was also an extrinsic motivator. So if individuals had easy access in terms of location, funding, times of day to community centers and exercise facilities, that helped facilitate engagement in physical activity. So when we looked at the barriers to physical activities, again, there were intrinsic and extrinsic barriers. And so we can all think of a lot of intrinsic barriers. And I think the top one was lack of time and daily obligations. So people had family obligations, social commitments that they had to attend to, which really sort of ate into their ability to engage in regular physical activity. Symptoms, interestingly, played a dual role. So they were facilitators, but they also acted as barriers. So there's a bit of a paradox there. So sometimes, although exercise and physical activity improved symptoms, sometimes symptoms actually got in the way of engaging in physical activity. Fear of relapse was another theme that came up around barriers to physical activity. So people who were in remission were a little bit nervous to participate, particularly in advanced physical activity and sport, for fear that they might, relapse their condition. People were also reporting feelings of self-consciousness, and this prevented them from participating in group activities such as exercise classes and team sports. And people were afraid of engaging in the wrong type of physical activity, particularly if they didn't have any instruction or support from healthcare providers. So in terms of extrinsic barriers, again, here's the seasonal effects and weather. Weather kept coming up, and maybe it's the Canadianism in us, but cold, heat, rain, snow. People talked about how living in Canada can really disrupt your engagement in routine physical activity. And when that disruption occurs, whether it's due to seasonal effects or weather, it's really hard sometimes to get back into physical activity and regain all the benefits that you had while you were engaging in it. Access, again, was another barrier identified, particularly for people who were not living close to exercise facilities, community centers. There were cost issues involved, and again, time of day issues. And the other thing that was interesting that came up was the role of urban design. So people talked about lack of parks, bike paths, walkability, and the concern for personal safety as an extrinsic barrier to engaging in physical activity. So what does all this mean? What do we do with all this? So the results of this study really help us provide insight into people who are living with axial spondyloarthritis and their understanding of physical activity within the context of their disease. And we are hoping that these findings will help to inform education and self-management programs that are aimed at really increasing physical activity engagement in people with AXSPA. So this is sort of phase 2 of our study. So stay tuned. We may have more to report that within the year, because we are working on all the results of what I just presented and how we can integrate that into an intervention to help improve physical activity. So now that we know all the good things about physical activity and we are familiar with some of the barriers and facilitators, how do we get started? How do we engage? So this is a quote that I'm going to start with, and this is from the study, and it's from a person living with axial spondyloarthritis who states, "One of the things I found in my experience with physical activity was it took a while to see benefits, but after a while it becomes part of your routine. It takes time and you have to make a habit of it." So how do we do that? So again, these are our recommendations from people living with axial spondyloarthritis. The first is make it fun. Pick an activity that you really enjoy, you're interested in, you feel confident doing. A good example that I often use is swimming. Swimming seems to be a very dichotomous form of physical activity. People either love it or they hate it. But if you're somebody who maybe was really engaged in physical activity before your diagnosis and it may have fallen off the to-do list, maybe that's something that you can pick up again because you're probably quite confident in it, particularly say if you were involved at, in a high school competitive arena. And that's, a way that you've got that self-efficacy, you may be interested in it, and it might be something that you really enjoy. You need to set goals too, particularly if, this is something very new and, you're just foraying into engaging into physical activity. And I often suggest that you use SMART goals. So SMART is a common acronym that we use for goal setting, not just with physical activity, but all aspects of life. SMART means specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. So for an example, if we were going to use walking as a goal, you might say that, as a specific goal, we're going to walk 30 minutes, measurable 30 minutes, 5 days a week. It's achievable because we all need to walk and therefore it's realistic, and it's timed. So we think that we'll be able to achieve this goal within the next 3 weeks. So there's an example of a SMART goal. And again, as mentioned and found from the research that I just presented, having that social support network is really going to be important. Engage your friends and family. They're going to provide encouragement, but they're also going to provide accountability. If you tell someone, they're going to ask you, hey, did you engage in, did you do your swim? Did you do your walk? So it really does help to have somebody to share in that journey with you. So in terms of examples of physical activities, so walking is probably the most achievable form of physical activity, but as mentioned, you have to make sure that you're walking brisk enough to really gain the benefits. So just as a reminder, if you want to gain that moderate aerobic intensity, you need to be walking to the point where you're sweating, but you're able to engage in a conversation. Commuting, as mentioned before, so walking or biking to or from work. You can park further away from your work entrance and walk in a little bit further, or get off one stop earlier if you're riding on transit. Home stretching and strengthening, easy to do. So engage in a daily home program. It can be something very simple. The CSA has a whole list of exercises that you can access on their website. You can include online instruction like yoga, Tai Chi, or Pilates, and this has become very accessible these days since the onset of the pandemic. And here we go again with our seasonal activities. We're so lucky in Canada to have so many different forms of activities that we can engage in throughout the year, whether it's cross-country skiing, skating, canoeing, hiking, paddleboarding, you name it, depending on where you live. Home chores, tidying up the house, gardening, building a shed, anything that you're doing at home that makes you sweat, go for it. Family will love you for it. And then sports. So just sort of the weekly pickup games of hockey, soccer, shooting hoops at school, spike ball. I just learned what spike ball is. Pickleball is another one I just learned about. All kinds of things that you can engage in. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that if you are foraying into physical activity and you're a bit of a novice, that's okay, but you have to know to avoid the boom bust cycle. So the boom bust cycle is if you're not used to engaging in regular physical activity, you need to do it at a level where you're not underdoing it, but you're not overdoing it either. Because what ends up happening is you overdo it, you end up getting pain, you flare, and then you drop your level of activity. Then you try and do it again, and again, you're dropping your level of activity so that overall, your overall level of activity is declining. Instead, slow and steady wins the race. So you really need to focus on gradually introducing some form of physical activity into your day-to-day routine if you really want to have success in maintaining this and keeping it consistent over time. So the next sort of and final phase of this is to provide you with some, pragmatic examples of exercise. And, just as a disclaimer, you should probably just touch base with your rheumatologist or physiotherapist to make sure that these are suited to you. But one thing I want to emphasize is that if you are beginning exercise for the first time, and it's been a while since you've participated in exercise, you need to expect mild discomfort. It is going to be discomforting, particularly if you're not used to it. And the example I often give is, say you start off pain-free. If your pain levels on a scale from 0 to 10 go to, say, a 4, that's okay. If they go a little bit past a 4, then maybe you need to, back off a little bit, but still continue with your activity. This is normal and it should be expected. And typically it should dissipate after about 24 hours. If it's persisting more than 48 hours and not improving, then you need to rethink your exercise routine, and maybe you need to touch base with a healthcare provider to ensure that your technique is correct and that you're approaching the exercises correctly. So what I'm going to do is give you some examples of exercises that you can do at home. I'm going to go over some stretching exercises and strengthening exercises. The stretching exercises will help maintain flexibility and mobility. And just as a reminder, with all of these exercises, so with this little icon here, this is our flexibility guy. You're holding these exercises 20 seconds, and you want to repeat about 3 times per muscle group. With the strengthening exercises, again, we want to use strength to help maintain posture and improve function. With the strengthening exercises, you don't hold them as long, maybe 5 minutes, but you're going to repeat them more 10 to 15 times per muscle group, and you can do 1 to 2 sets. And I will say, Eli, these I can provide sort of as a handout, and you can send out to participants at a future date. That's not a problem. So I want to start off first with posture. So posture is the foundation of function and physical activity, as well as appropriate exercise. Without proper function, you're not going to be strengthening and stretching the musculature properly. So this is actually my husband, who kindly I used as a model. And what I've done here is I've created this plumb line. So the plumb line sort of moves, it dissects the body, goes from the ear, the shoulder, his shoulder's a little bit too far back here. It intersects the hip, the knee, and the ankles. And a good way to sort of get yourself into a good posture is just like he's doing here, with his heels back against the wall, head back, chin in a neutral position. You might feel a little bit like a robot, but it's just to give you a sense of what optimal posture can feel like. You may not get perfection, and that's okay, but this is just an idea of how to optimize. So this is a good example of a stretching exercise to work on low back flexibility as well as hip flexibility. So you bend one knee in, so your left knee in, put it down, bring your right knee in, put it down, bring both in. You're exhaling with each bringing in of the knee and then lowering, and you repeat that cycle 10 times. So that's a good stretch to do first thing in the morning to help loosen up stiffness, or you can do it throughout the day if you're starting to feel any, restriction in your mobility. Extension in line, again, this is just a good stretch. If you can lie supine on the floor with or without a pillow, you can also do it in a bed, and you raise your arms overhead. Again, this is going to provide a nice stretch for the low back, upper back, shoulders, as well as the back of the neck. Bridging. So this is a strengthening exercise. So you see the icon has changed here in your left-hand corner. So this is a good core strengthening exercise, and it also focuses on the glutes. So the glutes or gluteal muscles are really important in supporting the hip joint. And sometimes in patients or people with axial spondyloarthritis, you can get hip involvement. So the stronger your glutes are, the less force going through the hips. Hamstring stretch. So this is a back-friendly way of doing a hamstring stretch. There's different ways of doing it. You can do it in standing, sticking your foot up on a bench, leaning over. That puts a lot of pressure through the low back. In this position, the low back is supported. You can get a belt or a towel or something to help use as arm extenders and really focus on stretching the gastrocs as well as the hamstrings in the back. The hamstrings are a critical muscle to stretch because the tighter they are, they change the position of the pelvis, and then it forces you into a more flexed position. So we want to make sure that our hamstrings are nice and loose. Moving on to the hip flexor stretch. So again, this is the opposite stretch of the hamstring stretch. So sometimes we can get really tight in our hip flexors. And again, that causes that flexed forward position when we're standing. So kneeling, having one knee on the floor, hands on your hips, making sure that your thighs are parallel, and then just lunging forward is going to create a nice stretch to the anterior front part of the hip. And then bird dog. So this is sort of a classic core strengthening exercise. So you want to make sure that you're kneeling on the floor with your knees under your hips, your hands underneath your shoulders, and you're basically reducing the base of support. So you're lifting up your opposite arm and opposite leg, and that causes your core to really kick in and be strong to prevent you from falling over. So if you find yourself wobbling while you're doing this exercise, that's a sign of core weakness. A way to make this exercise a little bit easier is, instead of having your leg and arm parallel to the floor, just bring it down 45 degrees, and it makes it a little bit easier. Dead bug. Now this is sort of the opposite of bird dog. It's working at the same thing, but from a different angle. So again, this is a really popular core strengthening exercise. So you start in this position with your hands up towards the ceiling, knees at 90 degrees. And again, the aim here is to bring your opposite arm and leg parallel to the floor. But the key here in this exercise is to really maintain your back flat against the floor. And this is where technique and instruction becomes really important, because if this exercise is done wrong, you end up strengthening the wrong muscle groups. you end up strengthening your hip flexors, which are already strong. And so technique is really, really important. Similarly with bird dog, if this is too difficult to keep your leg and arm parallel, just keep them at a 45-degree angle from the floor, and gradually as you get stronger, you can get them more parallel. Plank, another good exercise for core strengthening, and here you want to create an imaginary line that runs from your ear down towards your ankles, and you want to make sure that your neck is maintained in a neutral position. Plank, a good place to start is maybe 20-second, 30-second hold, see how you do, and then you can do 1 or 2 sets, and then gradually increase your time in this position. The other thing I want to mention here are squats. So it's really important that we strengthen our muscles so that the way we are strengthening it translates into function. So this is called neuromuscular training of muscles. And a lot of people may be fearful of squats because everyone's told them not to do them because it's really not good for your knees. However, if you do them properly, they are extremely beneficial for your knee strength and your overall function. Squatting we do every day, getting in and out of a chair, going up and down stairs, getting in and out of a car. It's a very important functional way of using our knees. What I want to highlight here is that here, the squat, the knees are done over the toes. The knees aren't knocked out and the knees are not knocked in. If you can maintain good alignment, then you shouldn't have problem doing this exercise. The last one is a stretch, and this is a rotation and sitting. And again, I like this because it's a combined movement and it's functional. We need to be able to turn and talk to people. We need to be able to back the car out from the driveway. So in this particular case, you're sitting, your bum should actually be a little bit further on the chair, and you can use the chair to help increase your rotation. You can kind of hang on to it and pivot around. You want to look with your eyes, because if you look with your eyes, you're going to end up rotating more. And when you get to the maximal position, you hold that again for 20 seconds. Your feet should be flat on the floor, not as demonstrated here. Little correction there. So just in summary, I think the biggest thing I want you to remember out of this particular talk, if nothing else, remember this. It's 150 minutes a week of anything. Just move. Anything. If you can sweat, even better. But the more movement you do, the better off you're going to be. And I'm going to give the last word to someone living with axial spondyloarthritis. And this, again, was from the research that I presented. Physical activity doesn't have a beginning or an end. It's something where consistency is key, because if you're not consistent with it, your symptoms just end up winning. So I'd just like to acknowledge that the study that I did present was funded through the CIORA, Canadian Initiative of Outcomes in Rheumatology Care, through the CRA. And I'm happy to take your questions. Remember, the best exercise is the one that gets done.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation that I'm sure resonated with a lot of people with us tonight. So basically the key message is physical activity is medicine, is like true medicine. I mean, if you feel like in an amount of time, just reducing your injection or hoping to stop your injection, sometimes you have to start somewhere, and physical activity is definitely something that is proven that can reduce your symptoms. Now, the question for everyone, and including myself, I've been through a lot of flares, and physical activity was always part of who I was and who I am today. But during those flares, I have to admit, it was almost impossible to do what I usually do. So what would you recommend in those moments for patients?
So it's a great question, and it's part of reality. And so I think that when it comes, everybody's flare is going to be different in how they manage with it. And again, this is where the synergy of pharmacological management and physical activity really come together. And it's that collaborative approach of both ends working together. And so sometimes, for example, if you're on biologics, for example, and you encounter a flare, you may need to supplement with other anti-inflammatories, for example, if indicated in your particular case. Now, if you're typically involved in physical activity, then you need to adjust. Maybe you need to tone it down a bit. So for example, I'm just using this, if you're normally engaged in recreational sports such as soccer or something like that, then maybe you need to just pull back. So you might just skip your soccer that day, but you don't stop moving. You've got to keep moving. And so you might be able to maintain your stretches. You might be able to, go for a walk, but don't stop. The key is that you have to keep moving, but you need to just dial it back. And then once the flare subsides, then you got to dial it back on. Because again, you don't want to get in a situation where, you've dialed it back, but you can't get back in. And that's why I think it's very key, particularly for individuals who, for some people, physical activity is really easy to engage in. For others, as much as it benefits them, they still feel that it's a chore. And I think that if you can maintain the routine of doing something, then that's better. And movement is always going to be better.
Absolutely. Amen. I mean, consistency always wins. Discipline over motivation is always best. So basically, you don't think about it and you just do it. But I have to admit, when I was, and this is another question that came up, is basically how can you differentiate between the good and the bad pain? So it's normal to feel some sort of a pain after exercise, but how can we differentiate between both?
So I alluded to that a little bit during the talk, but it is important because, there's the old adage, no pain, no gain, but it needs to be qualified. And my recommendation, so when I am instructing an individual on exercise, I always go back to that adage of, if you start off with no pain and you're experiencing discomfort, so there's a difference between discomfort and pain. And that discomfort is, say a 4 out of 10 on the rating scale. That's okay. But if it's starting to creep up and it's getting worse, or it's not coming back down, or when you stop exercising, you can expect to have pain afterwards, and that pain can last sometimes up to 24 hours. That's okay, as long as it's improving and it's not sustained. If you're getting pain that is worsening, or it's consistently getting more and more painful every time you engage in a particular exercise, then that needs to be a signal to say, okay, probably number one is you don't necessarily need to stop that exercise, but you have to check the technique. And that's why I do think it's important to have somebody who's knowledgeable in exercise prescription, whether it's a physio, a kinesiologist, a trainer, somebody who can ensure that your technique is correct, because 9 times out of 10, that's what's going to be causing the pain, poor technique. And I think that, if you've got good technique, and again, you're having a lot of pain despite doing everything right, then you need to touch base with your healthcare provider to see if there's anything else going on. The other thing too, just while we're on the topic of pain, that I thought maybe I could sort of talk about is, axial spondyloarthritis presents as inflammatory pain, which has its own unique characteristics. And very often that's how we as practitioners, healthcare providers, really kind of hone in on what the potential or the differential diagnosis is, just based on the patient's presentation and the characteristics of their pain. So Of course, you would expect an individual with AXPA to have inflammatory back pain, but that doesn't exclude them from having something else that's very, very common called mechanical pain. So mechanical pain is basically pain that occurs from an anatomical or structural change. So it could be a tendinitis, it could be a bulging disc, it could be a meniscal tear. All these things are more mechanical and extremely common. They present differently from inflammatory pain. And sort of the classic analogy is that inflammatory pain is usually better with activity, whereas mechanical pain is typically worse with activity. Inflammatory pain is associated with prolonged morning stiffness, usually more than half an hour, if not an hour, whereas mechanical pain is often associated with very short-lived stiffness. So a classic example is if you're getting out of a chair and it takes about 4 or 5 steps to get moving, that's classic mechanical pain. And so it's good to understand too the different types of pain so that when you are engaging in physical activity, you can start to think, is this my spondylitis, or am I developing a tendinitis for whatever reason, right? Or is it a mechanical back problem? So it is kind of good to be aware of the different types of pain that can present themselves when you're engaging in exercise.
This is great. So what I'm hearing from you is people with spondylitis can have both, but majority are like they have inflammatory type of pain. At the same time, tendinitis is part a bit of SPA. So in those cases, this is tricky. So what would you recommend for tendinitis specifically for people living with AS?
So tendinitis is sort of the gray zone. It's literally the Achilles heel, if you will, of spondylitis. So individuals with spondylitis can get something called enthesitis, which is a localized inflammation where tendons and bones insert into ligaments. And common areas is the plantar fascia, so that's the bottom of the heel. The Achilles tendon is the back of the heel. You can get it in the elbows on either side. And they can present as, tendinitis that you might get from repetitive strain. It is sometimes very difficult to differentiate. One of the clues is the onset. So if it's coming on for no reason, if you really haven't engaged in any particular activity that may have prompted this type of tendinitis or enthesitis, then it's probably more related to your spondylitis. Does it move around? Does it go from your ankle to your elbow? And you've got multiple areas of tendinitis, again, for no apparent reason. It's probably more related to your spondylitis. But if you have, for example, an elbow tendinitis and you were playing tennis for the first time in years last week, it's probably related to the tennis. So you kind of have to think of the context and the behavior of it to help differentiate. But we do even as clinicians struggle to sometimes determine cause.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So what would you recommend as stretching exercise, and would you recommend that on a daily basis?
For which?
Stretching exercises. Would you
Just
recommend
in general?
something in particular? Yeah, yoga, tai chi, or anything that basically, it's all about gaining flexibility again. So anything in particular that you would recommend, and would you recommend that on a daily basis, or just bi-weekly, tri-weekly basis?
So if you look at the American College of Exercise Physiologists, so they did this huge guidelines in terms of exercise prescription for the general population. They say that stretching can occur 2 to 3 times weekly. And now that's fine. One might argue that individuals with axial spondyloarthritis, given the stiffness that is part of the sort of symptom profile, stretching might be something that people want to do daily. And I don't see a problem with that. How you stretch, again, a home stretching program would be of benefit, but yoga, tai chi, Pilates, all those things are very beneficial and have been studied in axial spondyloarthritis and have been proven as effective forms at improving spinal mobility. So that's one thing. But I would also argue that equally important to flexibility is core strength. Core strength is critical in terms of maintaining posture. And so I agree that flexibility is important, but equally important is the strength, as is the cardiovascular fitness too. And so if you can find an activity that sort of combines those things, for example, swimming is great because it combines core strengthening, flexibility, cardiovascular fitness. If you look at things like yoga, core strengthening, posture, flexibility, and if you do those repeated asanas over and over again, you even get some cardiovascular component. And you know, if you're an individual who needs a lot of variety, then maybe one day you do yoga, or 2 times a week you do a short yoga, then you might do a home exercise program, then you go off and play pickleball with your friends or whatever, right? So I think you got to be kind to yourself as well. I think that, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to do it all at once. And I think that that's not necessarily realistic. I think that, if you're just engaging in a stretching program and that's it, then go for it. It's better than nothing. And then you just gradually add on to that, because you'll start to feel the benefit, and it just cascades into other areas and you want to do more.
Right. You just hit my favorite quote. You just have to be kind to yourself during these moments, because if you get really tough and the self-criticism really gets high here, you're never going to get things done. And it's basically the emotional pain is going to get even higher, and you're going to feel it in your body. I love that. Absolutely. So what do you say to your patients that always refer back to you and that always report back to you that they don't have time?
Well, it's tricky. And, you got to make time. And, there's Prochaska's stages of acceptance. I can't remember what it is, but people kind of have to have that contemplative stage. So if they're booking an appointment to see me, or even just attending, for example, this forum right now, that tells me that you're in a contemplative stage. You're thinking about engaging in exercise. You may not have the time, but you can always make the time. It's about priorities, right? And so that's a good step. But I think it takes, I don't know, like there's no, myself, I find that, it's hard for me to make time for certain things. And you kind of have to think about what motivates you. When are you the most, like what time of day are you the most likely to engage in a specific activity? Like for me, I find that the only time that I can exercise is first thing in the morning, 6 o'clock. And otherwise I'm toast. It's not going to happen. The other thing too, and this is a personal confession of mine. If I've paid for an exercise session, I'm going to go. So, you have to look at what motivates the individual and what motivates you personally. And, eventually you'll get there, but it's a bit of a journey. It's a bit of trial and error as well. Thank you for sharing this. That was powerful, actually, because just hearing it from you, the specialist telling us that you also have to commit to actually do it. You have to put it as a priority, and you have to put it before the other priorities in your life, because dealing with your own, improving your physical activity, your own body, and improving yourself, you're going to be better to actually help others and better perform in your life, etc. So this is very important. And I think a big component is also peer support. Just getting accountable here and having this accountability partner. This is very important. For sure. Any other? So, would you recommend that anyone with ankylosing spondylitis that just got diagnosed goes to the physiotherapist to actually start this process of getting to know exactly what can be done, what can't be done, and basically have that safety space or
that safety partner who's going to explain exactly the movements, the exercises, or just is it enough to just watch it online?
I personally believe that it's better if you have access to an individual who is knowledgeable. I think that you're going to gain more, because there's something to be said about the dialogue and the interaction that you just don't get from reading a pamphlet. And the studies show there's a hierarchy of benefits. So you do get some benefit. Like if you don't have access to somebody, you will get benefit from, getting a pamphlet or a video or something like that and doing independent exercise. So we do know that that is helpful. But if you look at the hierarchy of benefit, the next level up is that if you get some supervision and instruction in terms of how to do that activity, you're going to get more benefit. And if you engage in group activity in terms of exercise instruction, so working out with your peers, with somebody who is knowledgeable, you're going to get even more benefit. So I think that, it depends on where you're at as you're going through the journey of diagnosis. It's a lot to take in, particularly in the beginning, I think. But once I think that you're comfortable with where you're headed, then whatever is going to be easiest for you is probably a good place to start. And then if you're able to work through that hierarchy of access of instruction, support, then I think that it's great. But again, throughout the country, we're limited in terms of what's available, where we live, how things are funded. It's another level of complexity that could probably be another talk, frankly.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. Two other questions, and those are final questions. So first of all, if I'm stiff in the morning, is it okay to exercise? Is it okay to push myself? Wouldn't it actually damage my tissues or my tendons?
So yeah, if you're stiff in the morning, exercise is going to be important to help kind of limber you up and reduce that time it takes to kind of get active in the morning and feel like you're ready for the day. One caveat, though, I would say is that knowing your radiographic status is going to be important. And so if you have ankylosing spondylitis that is isolated in the sacroiliac joints and you do not have involvement in the spine itself, I'd say you have a green light, go do whatever you like. However, if you do have involvement of the spine, particularly if you have fusion of the spine, then that is going to impact the type of physical activity that you should engage in. And that's when I would say definitely talk to your rheumatologist or a physiotherapist, the Arthritis Society, somebody who is knowledgeable in ankylosing spondylitis.
Great tip here. I didn't think about that one. Another last question. So running is a big thing. Is it okay to run? And is it okay to run anywhere on any field? What are your thoughts on that?
So this actually leads from what I just said about knowing your radiographic status. So if you only have involvement of the sacroiliac joint, that is an immobile joint to begin with. It doesn't move. It's got a lot of ligaments that surround it. When it's inflamed, it's very painful. But fortunately, even if it's completely fused, it's not going to impact on your overall mobility or function. I say if running is the only thing that's going to get you moving, then go for it. And we have a lot of, like in our particular clinic in Toronto, I think we've got 3 or 4 marathon runners, and one who does those extreme marathons that are like 24 hours or something, and they do quite well. And so I think that, again, it depends on the specifics of your spondylitis. If you've got a little bit of bony bridging in the spine, then again, maybe it's okay. So I think that if it's going to be a question of, if running is your passion and that's what you want to do, and that's the only thing that is going to get you motivated to engage in physical activity, then I think that, you need to think about how can you engage in this activity safely so that you can get the physical activity done and gain the benefits. And that's when it becomes a discussion with the whole healthcare team.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Laura. That was a great talk. So many questions that are answered and answered in a very detailed and experienced way. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. That's really appreciated. Everyone, I think, enjoyed the talk tonight. And I just want to remind everyone tonight that this talk, we're going to have the same talk in French next week with Grigor Diab, who's going to be joining us from Montreal. And if you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the CSA and check our resources that are available for free on the website. Again, Laura, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure having you. Hopefully, we'll have you soon with us for another session on physical activity. Until then, I wish you all a great night. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.